In the summer of 1381, the common people of southeast England rose up against their government in one of the largest popular movements in the nation's history. Tens of thousands of common people participated, and some of the nation's highest office holders were executed by the mob. The revolt lasted just weeks, but it shook the country and the confidence of the ruling class to its core. The 14th century was one of the darkest periods in European history. A worsening climate made famines a frequent occurrence. Warfare became more expensive and widespread, and the outbreak of the Black Death in the middle of the century would traumatize the already exhausted continent. England was spared none of these calamities. At the time of the revolt, the 100 Years' War with France was in full swing and bankrupting the treasury. It had been years since the English had won a decisive victory, and their own shores were now at risk of French invasion. To make matters worse, the warrior king Edward III and his capable son, the Black Prince, died within about a year of each other, leaving the 10-year-old Richard II to take the throne. Just 4 years into his reign, the young king and his counselors would be put to the test as they faced the largest uprising the kingdom had ever seen. Richard inherited a feudal society with a strict social hierarchy. At the top was the king, who since the time of William the Conqueror was theoretically the sole landowner in the kingdom. Everyone else, including the nobility, was a tenant who had a feudal obligation to their liege. Below the king were the magnates. These powerful landholders included the nobility and church officials like abbots and bishops, and they held the land directly from the king. Beneath them were the gentry, landholders whose estates gave them enough passive income to not have to labor themselves. The largest group by far was the non-landlord population at the bottom of the hierarchy. Although most of these people were peasant farmers, there was actually huge diversity in the occupations and conditions of people in this class, which included craftsmen, artisans, townspeople, and peasants both rich and poor. There was one final but crucial division within this group: the free and the unfree. A free peasant household paid rent to a lord but could move to new land or give the land they held as tenants to someone else. They also enjoyed more legal rights, such as being able to appeal local judgments to the king. An unfree household, on the other hand, was legally the property of the lord. These people were known as serfs or villeins. They could not leave the manor without the lord's permission, were required to work the lord's fields as well as their own, and were subject to many more fines and duties than a free household. This is a rough sketch of the social order at the time of the Great Revolt. It was more or less the system that had existed for centuries, and any changes to it would be slow and gradual. That is, until the arrival of the Black Death. Bubonic plague arrived in 1348, and with it came apocalyptic levels of death and despair. Estimates on the death toll are always changing, but at least a third and maybe over half of the population died from the disease. To anyone still living, it would have seemed like the end of the world. Beyond the psychological implications of the plague, there were practical concerns that quickly became apparent. Crops were left to rot in the fields unharvested because there were so few people left to work the land. Most landlords produced nothing themselves and relied entirely on the lower orders paying fees and working their land to maintain their estates. With half of these people now gone, landlords risked destitution. The labor of the peasants, once so abundant and taken for granted, was now at a premium. With the labor market in their favor, workers could negotiate better wages with the threat of taking their services elsewhere. The ruling class responded with a number of laws that aimed to fix wages and prices to pre-plague levels, with heavy fines for anyone who disobeyed. Although the legislation was extremely ineffective, it didn't stop the courts from trying to prosecute. In the 1370s, 70% of business in the king's courts involved labor legislation. By the time of the Great Revolt in 1381, These rules had been in place for decades and were the source of immense grievance for the common people. The other major source of grievance that would lead to the revolt was the perceived mismanagement of the military and the tax burden that came with near-constant campaigning in France and the border with Scotland. These forever wars took their toll on the treasury, and Parliament had to find new ways of keeping the war machine afloat. To Parliament, it seemed that the commoners who had enriched themselves with high wages since the Black Death were ripe for taxation. The solution they found was to implement a new kind of tax called a poll tax. Traditionally, the government used wealth assessments of whole communities, and the locals figured out for themselves how to pay what they owed. With a poll tax, each subject of the king was expected to pay the same flat rate. So in 1377, each subject of the crown was ordered to pay 4 pence in tax. From Parliament's perspective, the first poll tax was a huge success. It was easy to calculate and collect, and it checked the wealth of the lower orders. But almost as soon as it had been granted, the money was spent. 2 years later, another poll tax was granted. This time, Parliament experimented with progressive rates to make the tax more fair. But it also became harder to collect and was seen as less of a success. In November 1380, Parliament passed the third poll tax. It got rid of the progressive rates and increased the amount owed by each subject by 4 times. It seemed to the lords that they had successfully kicked the can down the road one more time. They were completely oblivious to the resistance that awaited them. It was not long after collections began that government officials noticed something was wrong. The amount of money being brought in fell far short of expectations. In Essex, the taxable population had apparently dropped from 48,000 to 30,000. Because there had been no major outbreaks of plague in the last 4 years, this could mean only one thing: blatant tax evasion. The government sent officials to return to any county that fell short of their expected contributions. The heavy-handedness and corruption of these officials is recorded to have been enough to push some people over the edge. The rebellion began on the 30th of May in the town of Brentwood, as Sir John de Bampton, a representative of the crown, was holding a session of the king's peace. This was a routine meeting where representatives from surrounding villages came to conduct business with royal officials. A typical sight in the early summer days of medieval England. Meetings soon became decidedly out of the ordinary when the delegation from the village of Fobbing approached Bampton. The villagers anxiously awaited the moment that Bampton would command them to make an inquiry into tax evasion and pay the remainder that they owed. The representative from Fobbing, Thomas Baker, flatly refused the order. He said that Bampton himself had already accepted a payment for a tax, and that any further payment would be a new and illegal tax on his people. Bampton was totally taken aback by the insolence. He ordered the 2 armed sergeants who accompanied him to arrest Baker, but they were repulsed by a determined mob who had apparently planned the act of rebellion beforehand. The sergeants, though well armed, were hopelessly outnumbered by the locals, and Bampton was forced to flee with his companions back to London. The die was cast and the rebellion had begun. Fearing quick retribution, the rebels wasted no time in spreading the call to arms. Messengers were sent to even the smallest villages to rally as large a group as possible. Despite the bottom-up nature of the rebellion, the commoners had something of an ideology that would guide the rebellion from here on out. The uniting principle for the rebels was that their quarrel was not with the king, but with court officials, overreaching landlords, lawyers, professional jurors, and anyone else who participated in the corrupt system. Poll tax may have been the primary cause of the uprising, but it was far from the only grievance that the people wanted to settle. Some radicals, like the preacher John Ball, wanted to overthrow the entire feudal system in favor of extreme social equality. As Essex was in uproar, Word spread south of the Thames to Kent, the other county that would make up the bulk of the rebellion. Like their neighbors to the north, Kent swiftly mobilized. They were led by one of the most famous and enigmatic figures of the entire rebellion, a man named Wat Tyler. Very little is known about Tyler outside of his role in the rebellion. What's clear is that he was as charismatic as he was radical. He was a veteran and had probably seen firsthand the mismanagement of the war with France. His military experience helped give cohesion to the bands of rebels, and it was likely his decision to order all villagers who lived close to the coast to stay home and protect the country from French raids or even invasion. In just a few days, a number of high-profile targets were captured. Canterbury and Rochester Castle fell with apparently limited resistance. The prisoners inside were freed, and the keeper of the castle was taken into custody. All official documents were taken into the streets and burned. Anything with green sealing wax was given special attention, as it indicated financial documents. On the 11th of June, royal messengers arrived and demanded an explanation from the rebels for their actions. The government was in an extremely weak position, as the closest army available was on the border with Scotland, many days away and oblivious to the rising. The rebels responded that their mission was to save the king and his people from his evil advisors and restore the true commons. Remarkably, the messengers told the rebels that the king would meet with them personally on the outskirts of London to hear their grievances. It is entirely possible that at this stage the 14-year-old king had some sympathies for the rebels, or that he really believed a peaceful resolution was possible. In any case, the rebels were ecstatic. They flooded to London by the thousands, meeting downriver of the capital at a place called Blackheath. The king announced he would meet the following morning, as the day was already growing late. So the rebels passed the time by sacking the palace of Simon Sudbury, Archbishop of Canterbury and Chancellor to the king. On the morning of June 13th, the king departed the Tower of London by barge to meet the rebels. It was on the feast of Corpus Christi, a time of public celebration and gatherings. The auspicious timing only added to the high expectations of the crowd. When they came within sight of the rebels, the king's counselors refused to let him go ashore. So the rebels sent their demands to the royal barge waiting on the Thames. They reiterated their loyalty to the king and provided a list of top officials who they saw as traitors and demanded their execution. 2 of the named men on the list were actually on the barge with the king at the time. Although the king was still willing to talk, his council announced that negotiations were over for the day, and the boats turned around and headed back upstream. A huge crowd was stunned by the anticlimax. Unsatisfied with the outcome of the meeting, they descended on London itself. The citizens of London also had their own grievances with the government, and the rebels crossed the London Bridge unopposed. Once inside the city walls, the rebels had no shortage of targets. The homes of corrupt officials, lawyers, and anyone connected to the financial apparatus of the government were attacked first. King and his advisors were trapped in the Tower of London, surrounded by a city in flames. On the morning of June 14th, King Richard decided once again to meet with the rebels outside the city, this time to the north, at a place called Mile End. The plan was to lure the rebels out of the city, placate them, and let them disperse back to their homes to be dealt with later. The rebels presented the king with a new list of demands. This time, instead of asking for heads on pikes, they asked for things like the abolition of serfdom, a limit on rents of 4 pence per acre, and the right to work freely for any agreed-upon wage. The young king granted all of their requests. He even had letters drawn up sanctioning the rebels, and gave them permission to pursue any supposed traitors to the kingdom. All he asked was that they return peacefully to their homes. The rebels took the king at his word, and many even dutifully returned home, thinking Richard would set things right. Others waited for the clerks to finish writing the letters patent so that they could spread the news across the land and hunt down more traitors with the king's literal seal of approval. It quickly became obvious that the young king had made a huge blunder in giving so much ground in negotiations. Chaos continued to reign in the city. Most alarmingly, the rebels managed to enter the Tower of London itself, where they found the highest-profile victim of the whole rising, Simon Sudbury. His head and several others were put on pikes and paraded through the streets. Although roughly half of the rebels departed after the Mile End meeting, it can be safely assumed that those who remained were the more belligerent and determined half. Among them was Wat Tyler, who had refused to accept any peace agreements yet with the king. Lawlessness ruled the city as people used the confusion for cover to settle old scores. An outburst of xenophobia led to the killing of many Flemish immigrants working in the cloth trade, whose presence was long resented by the locals. King and his council decided on yet another meeting with the rebels outside the city. This time, they would meet at a place called Smithfield, and it would be the last such meeting of the revolt. The chronicles give a confused account of what happened next, probably because even those present had a hard time keeping up with events. The mayor of London called for Wat Tyler to present himself. The rebel leader emerged from the crowd, riding a small horse. He showed no sign of deference to the royal party, and even greeted the king in a familiar way, as if they were comrades or equals. Richard demanded to know why Tyler and his followers had not yet returned home as they had been commanded. Tyler replied that they still had demands that needed to be met before they would leave. The king said he would do what he could to meet the demands, but that the rebels must return home first. There was a moment of high tension as Tyler considered his next move. He called for water, swilled it in his mouth, and spit it on the ground, then mounted his horse and began to depart without asking permission. The mayor of London placed Tyler under arrest. Tyler resisted and struck the mayor with a dagger, but it was deflected by armor that was concealed beneath his cloak. The mayor struck back, mortally wounding the rebel leader. The crowd, watching from a distance, was shocked. Their charismatic leader, who had taken them so far, was defeated. King Richard saw a chance to press the advantage and rode out to address the crowd himself. Soldiers were in place to surround and attack the rebels, and some of Richard's advisors were probably urging him to bring the revolt to a violent but conclusive end. Instead, the king once again ordered the people to disperse and promised pardons if they did so. This time, remarkably, they obeyed. London was the focal point of the entire rebellion, and when the rebels finally left the city, the momentum of the uprising came to a sudden halt. But it was by no means the end of the bloodshed. Thanks to the crown's appeasement strategy, there were thousands of rebels in the surrounding countryside who thought, with good reason, that they were acting with the consent of the king. It would take weeks for order to be restored to the countryside. An emergency commission of high-ranking officials was given authority to, quote, punish anyone who makes or presumes to make riots, risings, and assemblies against our peace. The fallout was disastrous for the commoners. The scattered bands stood no chance against determined government forces. Though the flames were still widespread, one by one, the fires of rebellion went out. Following months would see thousands of accusations, court proceedings, and executions. It would seem that the rebellion was a complete failure. Parliament met once again to prepare yet another campaign in France. Serfdom remained legal and widespread. No checks were placed on overreaching landlords, and the power of the hated court officials would only expand. On the other hand, it would be almost 300 years before another poll tax was imposed on the English people. Even though the rebellion ended in failure, the elites of England learned that there was a limit to how far the commons could be pushed. The uprising of 1381 has maintained a long-lasting legacy in the English-speaking world. The cause of the rebels has been co-opted by dozens of different political ideologies looking for cultural myths that support their worldview. Images of bloodthirsty peasants have become a commonplace in depictions of the Middle Ages. Many of these tropes can be traced back to the frantic accounts of chroniclers in the 14th century. What is often missed is that the rebels were average people with a sense of what their legal rights were or ought to be. Their goal was not anarchy, but a conservative reordering of society, with a divinely ordained king ruling free subjects. Their cause was a failure, but the appetite for freedom and legal rights would not go away.